My emergency medication timer rang, dose overdue 30 minutes. The substitute teacher collected it. No phones or alarms during testing. The device vibrated 3 times against my wrist before the alarm sounded, an escalating pattern programmed specifically to wake me from sleep or grab my attention during the day. Mrs. Diane Kruger, the substitute teacher filling in for my regular AP chemistry instructor, looked up from her desk at the front of the classroom with an expression that went from irritation to fury in the span of 2 seconds. The alarm wasn't loud, just a persistent beeping from my med timer watch, but in the absolute silence required during the SAT subject test, it might as well have been an air horn. I reached for the device immediately, my fingers moving through muscle memory to silence it and check the dosage reminder. But Mrs. Kruger was already out of her chair and moving down the aisle toward me with the purposeful stride of someone who'd caught a cheater red-handed. "Bring that device to me right now," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You know the rules. No electronic devices during standardized testing. Period. No exceptions." I looked up at her, my stomach dropping as I realized what was about to happen. "This is my medication timer. It's medical equipment. I need to take my pills right now." I showed her the accommodation approval sticker on my test booklet, the bright yellow label that indicated approved medical accommodation, the same label that should have been accompanied by a note in her testing materials explaining my condition. Mrs. Kruger barely glanced at the sticker, her hand already extended expectantly. "I've heard every excuse in my 23 years of teaching. Hand it over. Now, you can have it back after the test concludes. If you refuse, I'll invalidate your scores and have you removed from the testing room." I felt panic rising in my chest, that familiar tightness that came not from fear, but from physiological reality. My body was already operating on a deficit, had been since I'd woken up that morning and taken my first dose of hydrocortisone at 6 a.m. The timer going off meant I was now 30 minutes past my scheduled noon dose, which meant my cortisol levels were dropping into dangerous territory. My name is Ethan Sawyer. I'm 17 years old, and I have primary adrenal insufficiency, also known as Addison's disease, a condition where my adrenal glands don't produce cortisol or aldosterone naturally. Without regular medication doses on a strict schedule, my body can go into adrenal crisis within hours. Crisis means shock, unconsciousness, organ failure, death. The med timer watch Mrs. Kruger wanted to confiscate wasn't a convenience. It was the difference between me walking out of that classroom or being carried out on a stretcher. I'd been managing my Addison's disease for 4 years when Mrs. Kruger walked into my AP chemistry class that Saturday morning as a last-minute substitute. My regular teacher, Mr. Patel, had been scheduled to proctor our SAT subject test session, but he'd called in sick at the last minute, with what the school office later told us was a severe case of food poisoning. Mr. Patel knew about my condition intimately. We'd gone through the accommodation process together at the start of the school year, reviewing my medical action plan with the school nurse and the testing coordinator. He had a copy of my endocrinologist's letter in his desk drawer. He'd watched me set my med timer before class dozens of times, had excused me to the nurse's office when I needed to adjust my medication, had even learned to recognize the early warning signs of low cortisol so he could prompt me to check my levels if I seemed off. Mrs. Kruger was a retired chemistry teacher from another district who apparently did substitute work for extra income. She walked into the classroom 15 minutes before the test was scheduled to begin, introduced herself with clipped efficiency, and immediately launched into a lecture about testing integrity and the consequences of cheating. Zero tolerance for electronic devices, she'd emphasized, making eye contact with each of us in turn. If I see a phone, smartwatch, calculator that isn't approved, or any other electronic device during this test, I will confiscate it immediately and invalidate your scores. No warnings, no exceptions. I don't care if you're checking the time or the weather or your heart rate. The rules exist for a reason, and I enforce them without prejudice. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I should have spoken up right then, should have raised my hand during her introduction and explained that I had a medical accommodation, that my watch was prescribed medical equipment, that she needed to review the testing coordinator's notes about my condition. But I'd been managing my disease for 4 years without major incident. I'd taken my morning dose on time. My noon dose was safely stored in my backpack with my emergency injection kit, clearly labeled in the medical supply bag that Mr. Patel had approved for me to keep at my desk during testing. I had my accommodation approval documentation. Everything was in order. And part of me, the part that was tired of being the kid with special needs, the one who always required explanations and exceptions, wanted to just be normal for once. Wanted to take a test like everyone else without drawing attention to my medical condition. So I'd stayed quiet, told myself that everything would be fine, that the alarm wouldn't go off during the test because I'd timed everything perfectly. Except I hadn't timed everything perfectly. The test had started 20 minutes late because Mrs. Kruger had insisted on rereading all the instructions despite them being printed clearly in our test booklets. Those 20 minutes had thrown off my entire schedule, pushing my noon medication window from the scheduled break between test sections into the middle of the chemistry portion. And now my timer was going off, and Mrs. Kruger was demanding I hand over the only thing preventing me from forgetting a potentially life-saving dose. "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and respectful despite the fear coursing through me. "This isn't a phone or a smartwatch for entertainment. It's prescribed medical equipment. I have Addison's disease and I need to take medication on a strict schedule or I can go into medical crisis. I have documentation. I have my medication right here in my bag. I just need 2 minutes to take my dose and I'll turn the alarm off. Mrs. Kruger's expression didn't soften. She crossed her arms over her chest, a gesture I recognized from every authority figure who'd ever decided their rules mattered more than my survival. I don't know what Addison's disease is, and frankly, I don't care. What I know is that you have an electronic device that's disrupting a standardized test. Hand it over now or leave the testing room. Those are your options. The other students were watching now, 23 pairs of eyes tracking the confrontation with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. My best friend, Daniel Kim, sitting 2 rows over, looked concerned. He knew about my condition, had been there when I'd been diagnosed, had visited me in the hospital more than once. I saw him start to raise his hand, probably to support my explanation, but Mrs. Kruger shot him a look that made him lower it immediately. Eyes on your own test, Mr. Kim. This doesn't concern you. I tried one more time, pulling out my phone to show her the medical accommodation email, the one sent by the testing coordinator to all proctors with a list of approved accommodations for students in the session. My name should be on here. Ethan Sawyer. Medical accommodation for medication timer and access to prescription medication during testing. Please just check your materials. Mrs. Kruger didn't even look at my phone. Instead, she grabbed it from my hand along with my med timer watch, her movements quick and decisive. Now you've added unauthorized phone use during testing to the list of violations. Both devices are confiscated. Your test is invalidated. Gather your things and report to the principal's office. I felt the world tilt slightly, that first warning sign that my cortisol was dropping too low. My blood pressure was starting to fall, my body's stress response system unable to compensate because I didn't have functioning adrenal glands. I need my medication, I said, hearing my voice come out shakier than I intended. I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm not trying to get out of the test. I'm trying not to go into medical shock. Please listen to me. This is serious. Mrs. Kruger pointed at the door. Out, now, or I'm calling security. I looked around desperately, trying to find an ally, someone who might intervene. Daniel was half out of his seat, clearly torn between helping me and not wanting to risk his own test validity. A girl named Rebecca Flores in the front row was staring at Mrs. Kruger with an expression of disbelief. The rest of the students looked uncomfortable but unwilling to get involved, and I understood why. These were SAT subject tests, important for college applications, expensive to retake. Nobody wanted to risk their scores by challenging the proctor, even if they thought she was wrong. I stood up slowly, my legs already feeling weak beneath me. I grabbed my backpack, fumbling with the zipper to get to my medication bag. Mrs. Kruger stepped forward and snatched the entire backpack from my hands. All materials remain in the testing room for security purposes. You can collect your belongings after I've completed my incident report. The medication bag was in that backpack. My emergency hydrocortisone tablets, my emergency injection kit for adrenal crisis, my glucose tablets for the low blood sugar that often accompanied cortisol drops. Everything I needed to prevent or treat the medical emergency that was now becoming inevitable. Mrs. Kruger, please, I said, and I hated how my voice broke. My emergency medication is in that bag. If I don't take my dose soon, I'm going to need an ambulance. I'm not exaggerating. This isn't a tantrum. This is a medical fact. My adrenal glands don't work. Without medication, my body can't regulate blood pressure or blood sugar or electrolytes. I will go into shock. She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language, her expression showing not even a flicker of doubt or concern, just absolute certainty in her authority and her interpretation of the rules. The principal's office is down the hall and to the left. I suggest you go there before I have you escorted. I walked out of that classroom on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, each step requiring conscious effort to execute. The hallway was empty, all other testing sessions in progress, nobody to ask for help. The principal's office was closed because it was Saturday, and the only staff on campus were the test proctors and a security guard somewhere. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself, trying to think through the fog that was starting to cloud my thoughts. Low cortisol affects cognitive function, makes it hard to problem solve, hard to advocate for yourself when you most need to. I pulled out my phone, then remembered Mrs. Kruger had confiscated it along with my watch. I patted my pockets frantically and found my wallet, which had my medical alert card tucked inside. The card listed my diagnosis, my emergency contact numbers, my endocrinologist's information, but there was no one to show it to, no one in the empty hallway to read it and understand that I needed help. I'd been diagnosed with Addison's disease at 13, after months of increasingly severe symptoms that doctors had initially dismissed as stress or puberty or growing pains. The fatigue had come first, exhaustion so profound that I'd fall asleep in class despite getting 10 hours of sleep the night before. Then came the nausea, the weight loss despite eating normally, the salt cravings so intense I'd eat spoonfuls of it straight from the shaker. My skin had darkened in weird patches, especially around my knuckles and scars, a symptom called hyperpigmentation, caused by elevated ACTH levels. My blood pressure had dropped so low that standing up too fast would make me dizzy and sometimes faint. Finally, after I'd collapsed during gym class and been taken to the emergency room for the third time in 2 months, an endocrinologist named Dr. Rebecca Winters had run the right tests: an ACTH stimulation test, cortisol levels, aldosterone levels, antibody panels. The results had been unambiguous: primary adrenal insufficiency, autoimmune in nature. My own immune system had destroyed my adrenal glands, leaving me dependent on external hormone replacement for the rest of my life. Dr. Winters had explained it to me in terms I could understand at 13. Your adrenal glands normally produce cortisol and aldosterone, hormones essential for life. Cortisol helps regulate blood sugar, blood pressure, immune function, and stress response. Aldosterone helps regulate salt and water balance. Without these hormones, your body can't maintain homeostasis. You'll need to take hydrocortisone multiple times daily to replace cortisol and fludrocortisone once daily to replace aldosterone. Missing doses isn't like forgetting a vitamin. It's like forgetting to breathe. Your body will go into crisis. The medication regimen had taken time to calibrate. Too little hydrocortisone, and I'd feel exhausted, nauseous, lightheaded. Too much, and I'd feel anxious, jittery, unable to sleep. We'd settled on a schedule of 15 milligrams at 6 a.m., 5 milligrams at noon, and 5 milligrams at 6 p.m., with instructions to take extra doses during illness or stress. Dr. Winters had prescribed the med timer watch specifically because studies showed teenagers with chronic illness had poor medication adherence when relying on memory alone. The watch vibrated before sounding an alarm, giving me warning to take my dose discreetly. It stored my medication schedule, tracked doses taken, and sent data to an app on my phone that Dr. Winters could review during appointments. It had cost $300 even with insurance, but Dr. Winters had insisted it was essential. She'd written detailed letters from my school explaining my condition and the accommodations I needed, including access to medication during the school day, permission to carry emergency supplies, flexibility with attendance if I was ill, and understanding that I might need to eat or drink during class to maintain blood sugar. The school nurse, Patricia Hammond, had been wonderful about implementing the plan. She'd met with all my teachers at the start of each school year, educated them about Addison's disease and adrenal crisis, made sure they knew that if I said I needed my medication or needed to go to her office, it wasn't optional or negotiable. It was a matter of life and death, except none of that preparation mattered when a substitute teacher who'd never been briefed on my condition decided that rules about electronic devices were more important than medical necessity. I made it about halfway to the principal's office before the symptoms accelerated. The dizziness intensified, the hallway tilting and swaying like I was on a boat. My heart was racing, pounding against my ribs in a way that felt wrong and arrhythmic. I was sweating despite the air conditioning, cold sweat that soaked through my shirt. Nausea hit in waves, my stomach cramping and churning. I knew these symptoms. I'd felt them before during the weeks before diagnosis, during the times I'd accidentally missed doses while adjusting to my medication schedule. This was my body beginning to shut down, system by system, as cortisol levels dropped below the threshold needed to sustain basic functions. I needed hydrocortisone immediately, needed it 15 minutes ago, needed it before the cascade of adrenal crisis became irreversible without emergency intervention. I tried to turn back toward the testing room, thinking maybe I could convince Mrs. Kruger or get another student to help me, but my legs gave out halfway through the turn. I caught myself against the wall, then slid down to sit on the floor because standing was no longer possible. My hands were shaking badly enough that I couldn't have held a pen to write if I'd tried. My vision was starting to narrow, darkness creeping in from the edges. I knew I needed to call for help, needed to scream or bang on doors or somehow alert someone that I was in crisis, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. Help. Somebody help me. I don't know how long I sat there in that hallway, time becoming elastic and meaningless as my brain struggled with insufficient glucose and oxygen. It might have been 5 minutes, might have been 20. I was aware of the cold tile floor beneath me, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the distant sound of a clock ticking somewhere. I was aware of my heart still pounding irregularly, of my breathing becoming rapid and shallow, of my thoughts scattering like marbles across a floor every time I tried to hold on to them. I was aware that I was dying, that without intervention, I would lose consciousness soon and progress to full adrenal crisis, the kind that required emergency IV hydrocortisone and fluids to reverse, the kind that killed people if treatment came too late. I tried to stay awake, tried to keep my eyes open and my brain engaged, because I knew that unconsciousness meant I couldn't advocate for myself anymore, couldn't tell paramedics what was wrong or what I needed. But consciousness was slipping away from me like water through cupped hands, no matter how hard I tried to hold on. The last thing I remember clearly was the sound of footsteps, heavy and hurried, and a voice I didn't recognize saying, "Oh my God," in a tone of pure alarm. Then nothing. I woke up in an ambulance with an IV in my arm and an oxygen mask over my face. The paramedic leaning over me was a young guy, maybe late 20s, with red hair and kind eyes. His name tag read, J. Murphy, paramedic. "Hey there," he said when he saw my eyes open. "Welcome back. You gave us quite a scare. Can you tell me your name?" "Ethan Sawyer," I managed, my voice muffled by the oxygen mask. "I have Addison's disease. I need hydrocortisone." Murphy nodded, checking the IV bag hanging above me. "Already on it." We've given you 100 milligrams of IV hydrocortisone, and we're running normal saline. Your blood pressure was 70/40 when we found you. Blood glucose was 52. You were in full adrenal crisis, buddy. Another few minutes and we'd be having a very different conversation. He adjusted something on the IV pump. Who found me? Security guard named Thomas Briggs. He was doing his rounds and saw you unconscious in the hallway. Called 911 immediately and stayed with you until we arrived. Probably saved your life. My brain was starting to clear as the hydrocortisone entered my system, thoughts becoming more coherent, memories of what had happened flooding back. I tried to sit up, but Murphy put a gentle hand on my shoulder. Easy. Stay lying down for now. We're about 3 minutes from County General. They're expecting you in the ER. Dr. Morrison is on duty and she's excellent with endocrine emergencies. You're going to be fine, but we need to monitor you for several hours to make sure you don't crash again. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The emergency room at County General was organized chaos, the usual Saturday afternoon rush of injuries and illnesses. They wheeled me into a trauma bay, where a doctor appeared almost immediately, a black woman in her 40s with gray-streaked hair, pulled back in a bun and sharp, intelligent eyes. Her name tag identified her as Dr. Angela Morrison, Emergency Medicine. The paramedic had been right. She was excellent. She reviewed my chart quickly, asked rapid-fire questions about my medical history and medication regimen, examined me with efficient thoroughness. Then she turned to the nurse preparing additional IV medications. Let's continue the hydrocortisone at 100 milligrams every 6 hours for the first 24 hours. Keep the saline running at 125 per hour. Check electrolytes, glucose, and cortisol levels now and again in 4 hours. I want a full metabolic panel and CBC, and let's get endocrinology down here for a consult. She looked back at me, her expression serious but not unkind. Ethan, you're stable now, but you were in severe adrenal crisis when you arrived. Your blood pressure was dangerously low, your blood sugar was critically low, and your electrolytes were significantly imbalanced. Another 30 minutes without treatment, and you could have had seizures, cardiac arrest, or permanent organ damage. Can you tell me what happened? Why did you miss your medication dose? I explained everything, starting with the substitute teacher and the confiscated timer and ending with waking up in the ambulance. Dr. Morrison's expression darkened as I talked, professional concern shifting to visible anger. Let me make sure I understand correctly. You informed your teacher that you had a medical condition requiring medication on a strict schedule. You showed her your medical accommodation documentation. You explicitly warned her that missing your dose could cause a medical emergency. And she confiscated your medication timer, your emergency supplies, and forced you to leave the testing room without access to treatment? I nodded weakly. She said rules were rules, that she didn't care what medical condition I had, that electronic devices weren't allowed during testing with no exceptions. Dr. Morrison pulled out her phone and started typing notes. I'm required by law to file a report when a patient presents with a preventable medical emergency caused by another person's negligence or actions. This absolutely qualifies. What that teacher did wasn't just wrong or insensitive, it was reckless endangerment. She looked at the nurse. Page administration. I need a patient advocate down here immediately. And someone call the patient's emergency contacts. They need to know what happened. My mom arrived 30 minutes later, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She'd been at work when the hospital called, had apparently dropped everything and driven across town going well above the speed limit. When she saw me in the hospital bed with IVs and monitors, she burst into tears. My dad showed up 10 minutes after her, still in his work clothes, looking equally terrified and furious. They listened to my explanation with growing horror, my mom gripping my hand so tightly I lost circulation, my dad's jaw getting tighter and tighter with each detail. A patient advocate arrived around 2 p.m., a calm woman in her 50s named Linda Zhao, who specialized in medical rights and healthcare navigation. She pulled up a chair next to my bed and opened a tablet. Ethan, I'm so sorry this happened to you. Doctor Morrison briefed me on the situation, and I've already started documenting everything for the hospital's incident report. I need to get your account in your own words, along with any documentation you have about your medical accommodation plan and your interactions with the substitute teacher today. She turned to my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Sawyer, you should know that what happened to your son constitutes a serious violation of his rights under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Schools are required to provide appropriate medical accommodations for students with documented disabilities. By confiscating Ethan's medical equipment and emergency supplies despite his explicit warnings about the consequences, this teacher violated federal disability law and potentially committed criminal negligence. We spent the next hour going through everything in exhaustive detail. My mom pulled up emails on her phone showing the medical accommodation plans she'd submitted to the school at the start of the year, comprehensive documentation from Dr. Winters explaining my diagnosis and requirements. Linda photographed everything, added it to her digital case file. She asked about the exact timeline of events, the specific words Mrs. Kruger had used, whether any other adults had been present or involved. When I mentioned that she'd confiscated not just my timer but also my phone and my entire backpack containing my emergency supplies, Linda's expression turned grim. That elevates this significantly. Confiscating the timer is bad enough, but taking your emergency medication when you'd explicitly told her you might need it for a life-threatening situation, that's actively creating danger rather than just failing to prevent it. My dad, who'd been quietly simmering with rage throughout the interview, finally spoke. What can we do? What consequences will this teacher face? Linda met his eyes directly. That depends on several factors. The hospital's incident report will be filed with state health authorities, since this involved preventable harm to a minor. Dr. Morrison can also file a report with local law enforcement if she determines the situation warrants criminal investigation. You have grounds for a civil lawsuit against both the substitute teacher personally and the school district for failure to properly train staff and ensure accommodation plans were followed. And you can file a federal complaint with the Office for Civil Rights alleging ADA violations. She paused. I should also tell you that cases like this often attract media attention, especially when they involve clear-cut violations of disability rights and life-threatening consequences. If you decide to pursue this publicly, it will put pressure on the school district to take meaningful action, but it will also mean your son's medical condition becomes a matter of public record. That's a decision you'll need to make as a family. My parents looked at each other, having one of those wordless conversations that long-married couples can have. Then my mom looked at me. Ethan, this is your story to tell or not tell. What do you want to do? I thought about it, about all the times I'd tried to minimize my condition, to avoid drawing attention, to just be normal, about how that desire for normalcy had nearly killed me today because I hadn't wanted to make a fuss during Mrs. Kruger's opening lecture, about how many other kids with Addison's disease or diabetes or epilepsy or other conditions requiring strict medication schedules might face similar situations if nothing changed. I want people to know what happened. If it prevents this from happening to someone else, it's worth it. Dr. Morrison kept me admitted for observation for 36 hours, monitoring my recovery and adjusting my medication levels. Dr. Winters came by Saturday evening, reviewed my charts, and added her own documentation to the growing case file. She was furious in the controlled, professional way of doctors who've seen preventable harm. Ethan, in all my years of practice, I've never encountered a case where an authority figure confiscated medication from a patient in active crisis. This is unconscionable. I'm writing a detailed report for your legal team and for the medical board, documenting exactly how dangerous what this teacher did was. Addison's disease is a serious, potentially fatal condition. Your medication isn't optional or negotiable. It's as essential as a diabetic's insulin or an asthmatic's inhaler. The fact that she was warned about the consequences and proceeded anyway is indefensible. She pulled up a chair, her expression softening. How are you doing emotionally? This kind of medical trauma can have psychological impacts beyond just the physical emergency. I felt tears prick at my eyes, the first time I'd really let myself feel the emotional weight of what had happened. I was scared. I knew what was happening to my body, and I couldn't stop it. I tried to tell her, and she wouldn't listen. She looked at me like I was lying, like I was trying to cheat or manipulate the situation. And I just kept thinking, I'm going to die because she doesn't believe me. Dr. Winters put a hand on my shoulder. That fear was completely valid. You were experiencing a life-threatening emergency, and the adult who should have protected you chose to endanger you instead. It's okay to be angry about that. It's okay to be traumatized by it. I'm going to recommend you see Dr. Philip Yang, a psychologist who specializes in medical trauma. What you went through wasn't just physically dangerous, it was a profound betrayal of trust. My parents hired an attorney Sunday morning while I was still in the hospital. David Rothstein was a partner at Rothstein & Associates, a firm specializing in disability rights, medical malpractice, and educational law. He came to the hospital Sunday afternoon with an associate, a sharp young lawyer named Kimberly Park, who'd apparently won several high-profile ADA cases. They set up in the consultation room the hospital provided, spreading documents across the table while I sat in a wheelchair, still connected to an IV pole but stable enough to participate. David Rothstein was in his late 50s, gray-haired and distinguished, with the kind of calm confidence that came from winning difficult cases. Ethan, I've reviewed the documentation your parents provided and spoken with Dr. Morrison and Linda Zhao about the incident. I want to be direct with you. This is one of the most clear-cut cases of disability rights violation and reckless endangerment I've seen in my 30 years of practice. The evidence is overwhelming, the consequences were severe, and the defendant's actions were egregiously negligent. You have an extremely strong case. Kimberly leaned forward, opening her laptop. We have multiple avenues for legal action. First, a federal complaint to the Office for Civil Rights alleging Section 504 and ADA violations. The school district was aware of your disability and your accommodation needs. They failed to ensure that substitute staff were properly briefed. That's a systematic failure. Second, a civil lawsuit against Mrs. Kruger personally for negligent infliction of emotional distress and reckless endangerment. Third, a civil lawsuit against the school district for failure to train, failure to accommodate, and institutional negligence. Fourth, depending on what the prosecutor decides, potential criminal charges for reckless endangerment or child endangerment. What are we looking at in terms of potential outcomes? My dad asked. David ticked items off on his fingers. For the civil lawsuit, we'd seek damages for medical expenses, pain and suffering, emotional distress, and punitive damages to send a message that this behavior won't be tolerated. Based on similar cases and the severity of harm here, I'd estimate a potential settlement or verdict in the range of $800,000 to $1.5 million. For the criminal case, if the DA decides to prosecute, Mrs. Kruger could face misdemeanor or felony charges, depending on how they classify reckless endangerment. For the federal complaint, the Office for Civil Rights could investigate the entire school district's accommodation policies, potentially resulting in mandatory reforms and federal oversight. And realistically, Mrs. Kruger will likely lose her teaching certification and face professional sanctions even if she avoids criminal conviction. He paused. I should warn you that the school district and their insurance company will fight hard. They'll try to argue that Mrs. Kruger was following policy, that she had no way to know the situation was serious, that Ethan bears some responsibility for not being more insistent. They'll try to minimize the damages and avoid setting precedent. We need to be prepared for a long, difficult legal battle, Kimberly added. But we also have leverage. The facts are indisputable. The harm was severe and documentable, and this is exactly the kind of case that generates public outrage. Most school districts settle quickly when faced with this level of liability and publicity. Rather than risk a trial, they'll almost certainly lose. The story broke on Monday morning, apparently leaked by someone at the hospital or school. Local news outlets ran with it immediately. Headlines screaming, "Teen nearly dies after teacher confiscates medication timer," and "School sued after substitute teacher triggers medical crisis." By Monday afternoon, it had been picked up by regional and then national news. My phone, which my parents had retrieved from the school along with my other belongings, was flooded with interview requests, friend messages, and social media notifications. David and Kimberly fielded all media requests, carefully selecting opportunities that would advance the case without overwhelming me. They agreed to one televised interview with the investigative journalist named Robert Crawford, who'd won awards for covering educational safety failures. The interview was filmed Tuesday evening in the hospital conference room. I sat in a chair with my parents on either side of me, my med timer watch visible on my wrist, and told my story to the camera. Robert was skilled at his job, asking questions that let me explain complex medical concepts in accessible terms while highlighting the emotional and physical trauma of the experience. Ethan, when Mrs. Kruger refused to give you your medication timer and emergency supplies, what went through your mind? I looked directly at the camera, remembering Kimberly's coaching about being calm and factual. At first I was confused because I thought she must not understand what the device was. I tried to explain that it was medical equipment, that I had approved accommodations, that missing my dose could cause a medical emergency, but she kept insisting it was an electronic device designed to cheat, that she didn't care what medical condition I claimed to have. When she took my backpack with my emergency medication, that's when I got scared, because I knew my body was already running low on cortisol. I knew I had maybe an hour before symptoms would start, maybe 2 hours before it became critical, and I had no way to prevent it. Robert leaned forward with careful sympathy. You tried to explain the seriousness of the situation? Multiple times. I told her explicitly that I have Addison's disease, that my adrenal glands don't work, that without medication, I could go into shock. I showed her my medical accommodation approval. I asked her to just check with the school nurse or the testing coordinator who would have my documentation. She refused. She said rules were rules, and that she enforced them without exceptions. She told me I was trying to manipulate her, that in her 23 years of teaching she'd heard every excuse. Robert's expression showed carefully controlled outrage, the kind that would resonate with viewers. You lost consciousness in a school hallway because she wouldn't let you take your prescribed medication. That's correct. I went into adrenal crisis, which is a life-threatening emergency. When the paramedics found me, my blood pressure was 70/40, and my blood sugar was critically low. Dr. Morrison told me that another 30 minutes without treatment could have caused permanent organ damage, seizures, or death. My mom's voice shook as she added her perspective. We did everything right. We submitted comprehensive medical accommodation plans. We met with the school nurse and Ethan's teachers. We provided detailed letters from his endocrinologist. We followed every protocol the school required. And it didn't matter because a substitute teacher who'd never been briefed on Ethan's condition decided her interpretation of testing rules was more important than his life. The interview aired Wednesday evening and went viral immediately. Within 12 hours, it had been viewed over 8 million times across various platforms. Comments poured in from people with chronic illnesses, sharing similar stories of having their conditions dismissed or their medical needs treated as inconveniences. Parents of children with diabetes, epilepsy, and other conditions requiring strict medication schedules expressed horror and solidarity. Disability rights organizations issued statements condemning Mrs. Kruger and the school district's systemic failures. The hashtag #BelieveMedicalNeeds started trending nationally. The public pressure was intense and building daily. Thursday morning, Detective Lawrence Bennett from the county sheriff's office contacted my parents. He'd been assigned to investigate based on Dr. Morrison's incident report and the media coverage drawing attention to the case. We met with him Thursday afternoon at his office, a small, cluttered room in the county justice building. Detective Bennett was in his early 50s, stocky and balding, with the weary competence of someone who'd seen too much human stupidity. He recorded our conversation, asked detailed questions about the timeline and Mrs. Kruger's exact statements, reviewed the medical records documenting my condition and the crisis. When we finished, he sat back and let out a long breath. This is pretty straightforward from a criminal perspective. We have a defendant who was explicitly warned that confiscating medical equipment would cause life-threatening harm. She proceeded anyway. The victim suffered severe, documentable harm as a direct result. We have medical experts who can testify to causation. The only question is whether we charge this as reckless endangerment or something more severe. He looked at my parents. The DA will make the final decision, but I'll be recommending criminal prosecution. What this woman did goes beyond negligence into willful disregard for human safety. The school district held an emergency board meeting Thursday evening. David and Kimberly attended as our representatives, along with about 500 community members who packed the auditorium. The board announced they were conducting an investigation into the incident and reviewing their substitute teacher training protocols. They offered a carefully worded apology that avoided admitting liability. We deeply regret the distressing incident involving student Ethan Sawyer. Student safety is our highest priority, and we are committed to ensuring all staff understand and implement appropriate medical accommodations. The apology felt hollow, a PR move rather than genuine accountability. Mrs. Kruger's attorney, a defense lawyer named Harold Simmons, who specialized in representing educators, held a press conference Friday morning. He stood outside the school district office and read a prepared statement that made my blood boil. My client, Diane Kruger, is a dedicated educator with 23 years of exemplary service. She implemented testing security protocols in good faith, following district policies designed to prevent cheating and maintain test integrity. The unfortunate incident involving Mr. Sawyer resulted from a miscommunication during a chaotic testing situation. Mrs. Kruger had no specialized medical training and no way to distinguish between a genuine medical emergency and a student attempting to circumvent testing rules. While we sympathize with Mr. Sawyer's medical condition, Mrs. Kruger's actions do not constitute criminal behavior. She responded reasonably based on the information available to her and the policies provided by her employer. Kimberly watched the press conference from her office and immediately scheduled a response. We held our own press conference Friday afternoon, with me seated between my parents and David and Kimberly flanking us. Kimberly delivered a devastating point-by-point rebuttal. Mr. Simmons's characterization of events is factually dishonest and morally repugnant. This was not a miscommunication. Ethan Sawyer explicitly told Mrs. Kruger he had a serious medical condition. He showed her his medical accommodation approval. He explained that confiscating his medication timer and emergency supplies would cause a medical emergency. She chose not to believe him. Mr. Simmons claims Mrs. Kruger had no way to distinguish between a genuine emergency and attempted cheating. Let's be clear about what that claim implies. It suggests that when a student shows you official accommodation documentation and warns you they could go into medical shock, the reasonable response is to assume they're lying. That's not reasonable. That's discriminatory. It's the kind of thinking that gets disabled people killed. Finally, Mr. Simmons's attempt to blame inadequate training is a smokescreen. The school district had comprehensive policies in place. Mrs. Kruger either failed to review them or chose to ignore them. Either way, she's responsible. You don't get to plead ignorance when your ignorance nearly kills a child. David added his own statement, his voice cutting and precise. We've filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit seeking damages exceeding $1 million and a federal complaint with the Office for Civil Rights. We're also calling for criminal prosecution of Mrs. Kruger for reckless endangerment and for the immediate termination of all school personnel who failed to properly brief substitute staff on student medical accommodations. This isn't just about justice for Ethan. It's about ensuring no other child with a disability faces this kind of life-threatening negligence. The district attorney's office announced their decision Monday morning, exactly 1 week after the incident. They were filing criminal charges against Mrs. Kruger for felony, reckless endangerment, and child endangerment. If convicted on both counts, she faced up to 6 years in prison. The announcement triggered another wave of media coverage, with legal analysts discussing the case on national news programs and disability rights experts weighing in on the precedent it might set. Mrs. Kruger was arraigned Tuesday morning. The courtroom was packed with press and community members. She arrived with Harold Simmons, wearing a conservative suit and an expression of quiet dignity that infuriated me. She looked like a respectable educator wrongly accused, not someone who'd nearly killed a teenager through arrogant negligence. Judge Richard Thornton presided, a stern man in his 60s known for running an efficient courtroom. Mrs. Kruger pleaded not guilty. Bail was set at $50,000, which she posted immediately. As she left the courtroom, protesters outside shouted questions and accusations. She kept her head down, saying nothing, letting her lawyer shield her from the crowd. The trial was scheduled for early December, about 2 months away. In the meantime, discovery began. David and Kimberly issued subpoenas for Mrs. Kruger's personnel files, all school district communications about medical accommodations, all training materials provided to substitute teachers, and security footage from the school. The district fought many requests, claiming privacy and institutional confidentiality. Judge Thornton, who was also overseeing the civil case, sided with us on most issues. The discovery process revealed damning information. Mrs. Kruger had been provided with a packet of testing materials that specifically included a list of students with approved medical accommodations, including my name and a brief description of my needs. She'd signed a form acknowledging receipt of these materials. Either she hadn't read them, or she'd read them and decided to ignore them when confronted with my timer alarm. Either way, her claim of having no way to know about my accommodation was provably false. The school district's training records showed that substitute teachers received a mandatory orientation covering disability accommodations and medical emergencies. Mrs. Kruger had attended this training 8 months earlier. The training materials explicitly stated that medical devices and emergency supplies must never be confiscated from students with documented conditions, and that any questions about accommodations should be immediately referred to the school nurse or administrator. Mrs. Kruger had received, reviewed, and should have understood these policies. The school district's insurance company apparently went into panic mode when they saw the evidence. According to David's sources, they were pushing hard for settlement because they knew a trial would be catastrophic. The security footage from the hallway showed me collapsing, showed the security guard finding me and calling for help, showed the paramedics working on me. It was visceral, undeniable proof of the severity of the crisis Mrs. Kruger had caused. In late October, about 6 weeks after the incident, the school district's attorneys requested a settlement conference. We met in a neutral conference room with a mediator, retired Judge Alice Garrison, who specialized in complex liability disputes. The district brought their full legal team, their insurance representatives, and Superintendent Barbara Klein, who had authority to negotiate. We brought David, Kimberly, and my parents. The negotiations were intense and sometimes hostile. The insurance company initially offered $400,000 with vague promises about improved training. David laughed them out of the room. We countered with $1.6 million plus comprehensive policy reforms, plus termination of the principal and testing coordinator for failure to brief Mrs. Kruger, plus a public awareness campaign about medical accommodations funded by the district. They came back with $650,000 and some reforms. We held firm, walking out twice when their offers felt insulting. Finally, after 16 hours of negotiations across 3 days, we reached an agreement. $1.3 million paid to me and my family, structured as a trust fund for medical expenses and college. A formal written apology from the school board acknowledging their failure to protect me and their violation of federal disability law. Immediate termination of the testing coordinator who'd failed to ensure Mrs. Kruger received proper briefing. Implementation of our demanded policy reforms, including mandatory medical accommodation training for all staff, creation of a medical safety coordinator position at every school, third-party audits of accommodation compliance, and a red flag system for substitute teachers to immediately verify student accommodations. Creation of the Ethan Sawyer Medical Safety Fund, providing free medical alert devices and emergency training to any student who needs them. And critically, no non-disclosure agreement. I was free to continue speaking publicly, advocating for change, and ensuring this story stayed in the public consciousness. The criminal trial began in early December. I'd been dreading it, knowing I'd have to testify, knowing I'd have to face Mrs. Kruger across a courtroom and relive everything. Dr. Yang, my therapist, had been preparing me for weeks, teaching me coping strategies and helping me process the trauma. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Wu, met with me extensively to prepare my testimony. She was a tough woman in her early 40s with an impressive conviction rate. Ethan, Harold Simmons is going to try to make this about youthful irresponsibility and testing pressure. He'll suggest you weren't clear enough about your condition, that you should have been more insistent, that teenagers sometimes exaggerate for attention. Don't let him rattle you. Stay calm, stick to facts, and remember the jury will see through his tactics. The evidence is overwhelmingly in our favor. The courtroom was packed for opening statements, press filling the gallery, my parents in the front row. Mrs. Kruger sat at the defense table looking dignified and wronged. It made me furious, that performance of injured innocence when I was the one who'd almost died because of her arrogance. A D.A. Wu delivered opening statements with clinical precision. This case is about what happens when an adult in authority decides their interpretation of rules matters more than a child's life. Ethan Sawyer is 17 years old with a serious medical condition that requires medication on a strict schedule. He's managed this condition responsibly for 4 years. He followed every protocol, submitted all required documentation, wore his medical alert watch as prescribed by his doctor. On the day in question, he did everything right. And he nearly died anyway, because Diane Kruger refused to believe that a student's medical emergency was real. Wu walked the jury through the timeline with devastating thoroughness, using medical records and expert testimony and my accommodation documentation to build an undeniable narrative. She showed them my MedTimer watch with its alarm function and medication schedule. She explained how Addison's disease works, how missing doses triggers crisis, how crisis can kill. She showed them hospital records documenting the severity of my condition when paramedics found me. She played audio from the 911 call when security guard Briggs found me unconscious, his voice shaking with urgency. I testified on the second day, walking to the witness stand with my heart pounding but my head clear. A D.A. Wu led me through my testimony with gentle questions. I described my diagnosis, my medication regimen, my accommodation plan. I described the testing day, Mrs. Kruger's zero-tolerance speech, the moment my timer went off. I described trying to explain, being dismissed, having my medication and emergency supplies confiscated. I described walking into that hallway knowing I was going into crisis and having no way to stop it. When you realized Mrs. Kruger wasn't going to return your medication timer or emergency supplies, what did you do? Wu asked. I tried to get help. I thought about going back to the testing room to get another student to intervene, but by that point my legs weren't working properly. Low cortisol causes muscle weakness and coordination problems. I made it about halfway to the principal's office before I had to sit down. Then I couldn't stand back up. I knew I was in crisis at that point. I knew I needed emergency help, but there was no one in the hallway and my phone had been confiscated, so I couldn't call 911. What were you thinking as you sat there? That I was going to die because she didn't believe me, that I'd done everything right, followed every rule, tried to explain, and it didn't matter. That's terrifying, knowing you're dying and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The cross-examination was brutal, but I held firm. Harold Simmons tried every angle, suggesting I hadn't been clear enough, that I could have been more insistent, that I should have escalated to physical confrontation if the situation was truly life-threatening. Each suggestion was more absurd than the last. Mr. Sawyer, you claim you told Mrs. Kruger about your medical condition. Did you specifically use the terms adrenal insufficiency and adrenal crisis? I said I have Addison's disease, and that missing my medication dose would cause me to go into medical shock. Those are the exact words I used. My medical accommodation documentation uses those specific terms, which she had access to if she'd bothered to check. But you can't be certain she understood the severity, can you? Medical terminology is complex. Perhaps she thought you were exaggerating. The device alarm literally said dose overdue. The accommodation paperwork literally said life-threatening if medication delayed. How much clearer could I have been? Should I have shown her autopsy photos of Addison's patients who went untreated? Simmons's face flushed. Your Honor, the witness is being argumentative. Judge Thornton looked at me with something that might have been approval. The witness is answering your question, Mr. Simmons. Perhaps you should ask better questions. The trial lasted 9 days. Dr. Winters testified about Addison's disease and the critical importance of medication timing. Dr. Morrison testified about finding me in adrenal crisis and the treatment required to save my life. Security guard Briggs testified about finding me unconscious, about how scared he'd been that he was too late. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. When they returned, the forewoman was an older woman with kind eyes who'd cried during my testimony. Judge Thornton asked for the verdict. On the count of felony reckless endangerment, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. On the count of child endangerment, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. Mrs. Kruger's face crumpled. Harold Simmons put a hand on her shoulder, but she shook it off, her composure finally breaking. My parents gripped my hands, my mom crying with relief. Ada Wu allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Sentencing occurred 3 weeks later. Judge Thornton reviewed victim impact statements from me, my parents, Dr. Winters, and other families of children with chronic illnesses. He reviewed character references from Mrs. Kruger, letters from former students and colleagues. Then he looked at her directly. Mrs. Kruger, you had a choice when Ethan Sawyer told you he was experiencing a medical emergency. You could have chosen to believe him and let him take his medication. That would have cost you nothing. Instead, you chose to assert your authority, to assume a child was lying about a life-threatening condition. That choice nearly killed him. He sentenced her to 3 years in prison with possibility of parole after 18 months, permanent revocation of her teaching certification, 5 years probation after release, and mandatory completion of disability awareness education. This sentence reflects both punishment for your reckless disregard and protection for other children. The aftermath unfolded over months. The settlement money went into my trust fund. The Ethan Sawyer Medical Safety Fund began operating, providing devices and training across the district. The policy reforms were implemented with rigorous oversight. Testing coordinator Margaret Russell was terminated for her failures. Mrs. Kruger served 20 months before being paroled, her teaching career over, her name on do-not-hire registries. I graduated high school with honors, gave a speech about advocating for your own medical needs, even when authority figures dismiss you. I'm in college now studying public health and disability rights advocacy. I still wear my med timer watch every day, still carry emergency supplies, but now I also carry legal precedents and the knowledge that if someone tries to confiscate my life-saving equipment again, they'll face real consequences. The scar from my IV has faded, but the memory hasn't. My emergency medication timer rang dose overdue 30 minutes that day. The substitute teacher collected it anyway, choosing rules over my survival. She nearly killed me, but I lived, and I made sure the story mattered. Not for revenge, though justice felt earned, because every kid with a chronic illness deserves to have their medical needs believed and respected. Mrs. Kruger said she enforced rules without exceptions. Turns out some exceptions exist to prevent people from dying. She learned that the hard way. I survived to make sure no one else has to. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.